Welcome everybody to a challenge that I have for you. The way that this quest will work is that I will give you a puzzle dedicated to every chess piece other than the king. So we'll start off with the pawn, then we'll look at the knight, then the bishop, then the rook, and we'll end off with a queen puzzle. Now, some of these puzzles are incredibly hard, and I would recommend taking as much time as you can for each one of these. So maybe 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, and more than that is, of course, even better. Feel free to let me know down below which of these puzzles you enjoyed, which of these puzzles you got right, which ones you thought were very hard, whatever you thought about these puzzles. And with that out of the way, let's begin. We're starting with the pawn puzzle. You can see here, all of these puzzles are going to be white to move. Pause the video to take as much time as you need to find the solution, and I will now explain the answer. Notice that the king here is very restricted. It already has very limited squares, and the only square it can go to is here on c5, which explains the first move, d4, restricting the king's movement, stopping the king from having any square to move to, and the next move, regardless of what black does, let's say they push this pawn or they can promote, it really doesn't matter because the next move is c3 checkmate. Let's move on to the knight. Here is the knight puzzle. Notice you have two knights along with two pawns and of course a king, whereas black has a lot more material. So you have to use your pieces wisely. Again, take some time, pause the video, and try to solve this one, and let's begin. It is knight to e7 check, giving away your knight, but then putting the rooks and the queens in a very easy knight cycle, as you can see here. And that is exactly the cycle that you're going to go into. So knight to e3 check. Notice another thing to note, the king only has two squares to move to. So the king has to go here. You give a check. Again, the king can only go here. You give a check. The king can only go here. Check. King can only go here. Check. Here. Check. Here. And aside from just taking all of black's pieces in a very humiliating way, you also ended off with checkmate here with g4. The thing that you might be asking is why couldn't you have started with g4 here? Well, the issue is then actually black can sacrifice the queen. And even though this might not look appealing, the end result, let's say after you take the rook, is that black is just comfortably up material here. And so instead, you do indeed first have to take all these pieces, get rid of the queen, and then deliver checkmate. Moving on to the bishop, we have this puzzle here. Again, as always, take some time, try to solve it, and let's go over the answer. The thing to note here is that the king is very trapped, and you have a lot of bishops to use. And so if you were to take this bishop, take this pawn with the bishop, they take back, and then you take, that would almost be checkmate, but they actually have this rook here that could move and block it, which is why you first take away the rook, and then after they take back with the bishop, only move. Notice that if they do something random like knight c6, then you comfortably just take the rook and then take this knight, and you're just up, for example, a lot of material after this, let's say, and which is why after takes, they have to take here, but that is actually even worse because then you just have checkmate right away. And so the idea here is that you kind of remove the defender of this, and after you remove it, then you end up with checkmate on the board with this really beautiful bishop sacrifice. Moving on to the rook, we have this puzzle here. Now this one's a bit different. In this one, there are 3 checkmates that you can do in 3 moves. I will show you 2 of them, and the third one is the trickiest one, and that one you will have to try to solve on your own. So the first one is rook takes h4. The king has to move. Now you give a check. Now you restrict the king's movement, forcing it to this square where now the king is actually helping the other king have no moves. So then rook to g3 is checkmate. The other one is if you take with this rook instead, and now after the king moves, you go rook to g4, the king moves again to the same setup, and you give a checkmate. And notice that if the king in any of these positions ever went down, then you also will be able to do a checkmate only with the kings this way this time, but again, restricting the movement of the other king. So these are the easy checks, or checkmates in 3 by just taking the pawn with one of the rooks. The challenging one, well, that one you should try to solve right now. Take some time, pause the video, and let me explain the solution. Rook to h3, a really beautiful rook sacrifice, because after the king takes, you have king f2, and you're cutting off the king from going anywhere onto the g file. The king has to go down, and again, the kings facing each other leads to checkmate. And of course, if the king moves down, this one's a little bit less nice, but it is still going to be checkmate after rook takes, and then checkmate, like we saw in a previous position. And so a really beautiful rook to h3 sacrifice. This one was very tricky to find because there's just so many rook moves that you can do. It's pretty overwhelming. But a little tip here is that you kind of see that this rook is a bit more important because it's blocking the king. So if you move this, then the king suddenly gets into a more open position. So this rook is kind of the one that you want to stay, and then you can try to look at these other rook moves with the other one. Let's move on to the queen, which is the final one. And here, again, it's not so straightforward. Instead, what you have to do is not find a checkmate, because I'm sure that there's hundreds of them. Instead, you have to find all 4 checkmates in one move. And again, the reason that this is a bit of an issue is that it's very overwhelming. All of these moves with the queens are just very, very overwhelming. So once again, pause the video, try to take some time to solve it. And now let's go over the checkmates. So the first thing to note, these queens blocking off them. So you can give a check here, checkmate in 1, or a check here, the other checkmate in 1. And then the other thing to note is that this king is really restricted on movements, but it has these 2 squares that it could potentially move to because of this file not being under control, which is why you want to get a queen to this square where it would control all of these 3 squares. So queen to c4 checkmate, or the other queen to c4 checkmate. Either way, it would be a checkmate in 1. So those are the 4 checkmate in 1s. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, this little quest. Let me know if you guys did, because I'll gladly make a part 2 to this. Subscribe if you're new around here, like this video if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.